Greetings, Audio Avengers! Welcome to the Marvelous TV Club, your headquarters for the most insightful and entertaining discussions of the latest episode of Marvel television. And that means it's time to dig even deeper into the first episode of Loki. There are a lot of podcasts that talk about Marvel TV, but what separates the Marvelous TV Club from the pack is the way we organize our approach. Instead of jumbling all of our thoughts together into one big heap, we divide our analysis of each Marvel TV episode into 3 distinct shows, each with their own unique lens. Storycast is live, and Maeve and Amanda reveal the themes driving the episode, specifically the eternal struggle between fate and free will, as well as the dehumanizing effect of dystopian bureaucracy. We explore the episode's influences from Beetlejuice and Groundhog Day to Paradise Lost and 19th century German philosophy. On Monday, our character cast with Christine Kippens will explore Loki's powerful emotional journey in this episode, as well as how much we can trust these TVA folks. But now, it's time for this show, PonderVision. This is the show that unearths the deepest and most captivating questions raised by the episode and teases out their most profound implications, whether we like them or not. If you want to expand your mind, settle in with us and get into your weird place, folks. I'm your multi-hyphenate host, producer, editor, social media maven, and more, Marc Faletti. And as always, on PonderVision, I'm joined by the attorney so persuasive the TVA won't let them near one of their kangaroo courts, Jesse Taylor. How's it going, man?
I am burdened with glorious takes tonight.
Yeah, I'm excited about that, but that's not the only thing you're burdened with, man. You have a cool new project. I think you should tell people about this awesome newsletter I just read last week.
Awesome. So I just started a new newsletter called Action Figure Birthday. It is sort of longer form takes on pop culture, maybe a little intersection with politics or current events, whatever's going on. Last week, I had my first newsletter come out, which was about actually my first exposure to Star Wars, which was a lot sadder and more fearful than one might think, largely because I didn't know who Darth Vader was. And so I got a little action figure of Darth Vader tucked in with some other figures for my birthday. And I then hid it in my basement for years, afraid to ever confront it or Star Wars.
Yeah, and look, the essay really moved me as a kid also who, I first saw Star Wars on a film reel in a preschool, and it was like a half-hour version, and it made absolutely no sense, and it was its own really strange experience right before our nap time on cots. It was like a whole thing. It just really brought me back to my youth, and for folks who haven't had a chance to read Jesse in print, he's just so funny and insightful. So Action Figure Birthday, if you like Star Wars or anything else besides, just our little Marvel pod here. That's all we focus on here. But Action Figure Birthday is going to talk about a lot more. And I just, I don't know. I'm excited to have more Jesse writing in my life.
And you can find it at actionfigurebirthday.substack.com.
It is well worth your time, folks. And before we get into the episode, I just want to remind you guys, we have a ton of new stuff going on. I mentioned that we're on Twitter and Instagram now at Marvelous TV Club. We also have a totally new website, and that includes some merch. So if you like our cool logo with Loki on it, if you want to see that, or the Loki logo with our names on it, if you want that on some mugs, on some shirts, on an actual cloth mask, all of that is available and will only be available during the run of Loki. We will change that logo again and all that stuff will come down. I dig the Loki logo. I hope you dig it too. So check some of that stuff out. And let us know what else you're looking for. Again, hit us up on any of the social channels and let us know if there's merch you want to see from us. Today on PonderVision, though, we are going to explore a couple different topics. One, of course, is the peculiar details of the TVA, because there are a couple things that jumped out at me that I had to talk about with only one person in the universe, and that's Jesse. Then I want to get into the mind-boggling paradox of timeline management. And then we will get into the unique emotional resonance of this episode, which was especially touching. So those are the big areas we're going to touch on, as well as what other comparisons might be out there for this episode. But we start with the peculiar details of the time variance authority. And there's one in particular I keep returning to every time I watch the episode, which is admittedly already like 4 times now. I loved that creepy robot that zapped off the Asgardian leather of Loki. I thought he was so adorable and also kind of scary. Jesse, in my experience in the Marvel Universe, when we meet an AI, it often becomes someone heroic or terrible. I want to know if I should be concerned or excited about what could happen to Mr. Clothes Zapping Smiley Face Robot Guy with the creepy pincher arms. If that robot were to evolve into a recognizable Marvel Comics character, like someone we haven't seen in the MCU yet, like Jarvis turned into Vision, who might that robot be a precursor for?
So first thing I have to say is I thought you were going to say, in your experience getting your clothes zapped off.
You wear the wrong thing to school and all of a sudden they take you into the back room. Did that not happen to you?
I mean, every time I've ever met you, your clothes have been off, but that's a completely different issue.
I'm always getting grabbed by the TVA. That's a real problem.
So I have a kind of out of the box theory, and we've talked about this, but we haven't shared with each other what our theories are.
Mm-mm.
And I know we're both worried that we're going to have the same theory as each other. So I'm just going to go with it.
I think you mean excited, Jesse. I think you mean excited that we might have the same theory.
There's no word for this emotion. Let's be honest.
That's right.
Yeah. I'm going to go with the Molecule Man.
Ooh, okay, totally different. Tell me, first of all, tell folks who the Molecule Man is.
Okay, so very brief version of a very long-standing, complicated character. Short version is, started out in the 60s as a guy named Owen Reese, was introduced in Fantastic Four 30 as authored by Lee and Kirby. And I say authored by because, again, we've talked about it on this podcast, but there's always a bit of dispute over who came up with what. Molecule Man is sort of the epitome of a 60s era comic book creation in that I'm not sure they quite understood the science behind what they were saying or the implications of what he could do, but it sounded kind of cool and it let them churn out another issue. So the idea in his first appearance is that Owen Reese could control any inorganic molecule, which means that he could reshape them, obliterate them, create more, do whatever he wanted. And in the span of Fantastic Four 30, he actually puts up a glass shield over the entirety of New York City to keep the Fantastic Four out. And as the character developed, he was given more and more sort of personal tics, issues, even verging on various forms of mental illness, because one of the things writers realized is that you had to have some narrative way of limiting or refocusing what the character did, because otherwise a character who can just reshape reality,
it's too much.
Right. And this wasn't the era where characters were anything more than superheroes or villains. And if it's Captain America versus someone who can reshape the shield, the guy who can reshape the shield's always going to win.
Yeah, turn it into butterflies. What are you going to do now, Steve?
Right. And it's like, basically, if somebody had the Infinity Stones at all times, but was also just a random guy from the Bronx.
Yep.
And over the years, what Molecule Man has become is sort of this multiversal fixture. And the way the character currently stands is that if there's a Molecule Man in every dimension, so every world in the multiverse has a Molecule Man. And the Molecule Man isn't just a guy who has these powers. He's a bomb. He is literally a bomb who, if he is destroyed, will destroy the entirety of reality. So effectively a trigger / a failsafe to ensure that the universe continues to survive. And so my theory is that there is a Molecule Man in the MCU.
Okay.
And the TVA has repurposed him because we're dealing with like kind of the original 60s weak-willed Owen Reese who doesn't really understand his powers. And they've basically captured him in this robot that they made him create. And this is the service that he provides. And maybe he powers a lot more of the TVA. Who knows?
That is extremely out there, and I'm here for it. My favorite thing about Molecule Man was just that he had a dope relationship with this cool lady named Volcana. She was also, admittedly, a bad guy technically, but they always seemed really genuinely in love, and it was just this really cool, healthy relationship in the MCU in the 80s when they didn't really get into that stuff as much. I just remember that in like Secret Wars and some other fun series where Molecule Man appeared. So I just remember Molecule Man as being a good family man. Maybe the robot will be seeking companionship as well.
I hope so, with some sort of, temporal volcano. Who knows?
I stuck with robots, man. I guess I'm stuck in my own little box. I didn't realize how much I was in a box until you said Molecule Man. I propose that this is the first iteration of the robot known as the Super Adaptoid.
Ooh, that's also a nice deep cut.
Here's the thing about Super Adaptoid. He's this robot that was built, and he can basically mimic the superpowers of anyone nearby him. But here's what's cool about him. First of all, he was built with a shard of the Cosmic Cube. And what do we know is presently in possession of the Time Variance Authority? The Cosmic Cube. It's right there in front of them. And I just feel like this scanner has been scanning all of these powerful beings who were capable of holding all these Infinity Stones that wound up in that drawer. So imagine how many beings of power this robot has scanned and seen, all the powers it's encountered, all the cool clothes and outfits and costumes it must have zapped away. Its databanks must be full of ideas. I just feel like it's the perfect way to bring the Super Adaptoid into the MCU. What do you think?
I like it. And that's also, going back to Star Wars, that's not a name I've heard in a long time.
Yeah, it has been a minute since the Super Adaptoid showed up in the comics. I actually don't recall seeing him in the last 30 years, but I'm sure he's shown up somewhere.
And that's also the kind of character when Marvel's kind of feeling itself right now, I could see somebody just going back and saying, like, find me a character.
Yeah,
Super Adaptoid.
Hey, that's how Guardians of the Galaxy came along. You never know.
Right.
It's never too late. The next question I want to look into about the TVA, though, actually came to us from Character Cast's Christine Kippens, Jesse. She wants to know, how do you think the judicial process works in the TVA? And I just want to point out, she specifically wanted to make sure this question was, and I quote, mostly for Jesse. So let me, the non-legal fool here, get out of the way. I'm clearing out. Jesse Taylor, help me. just giving Christine a hard time here. Look, Jesse, help me understand, though. This judicial process was disorienting and confusing. How do you think this thing works?
Works kind of like Florida Stand Your Ground law.
Oh, shit. That doesn't sound good.
No, like if the TVA feels threatened, you're dead. Like that just seems to be the issue. So, basic issue with how this worked. Loki's time travel / variance was not intentional and was in fact the product of something that Loki is then explicitly told was supposed to happen. The Avengers time traveling caused the variance, but Loki's the one who gets punished for it. Then Loki shows up and is told to plead guilty or not guilty to the inadvertent thing he did. And he was already in custody. He took an opportunity to get out. There was no intent. There was no mens rea. There was no anything involved that would lead you to believe he intentionally became a variant from the timeline.
Okay.
And I talked with Christine about this a little bit, actually. And one of the things I just wanted to do briefly is talk about what due process is. So due process in America, at least, is a constitutional guarantee that whenever the government is attempting to restrict certain rights, usually life, liberty, and property, that you'll be provided a certain level of process. And that process may include the ability to see the evidence, to have advance notice, to have a hearing, to have a jury, depends on the nature of the restriction that the government's seeking to impose. There's also what's called substantive due process. And substantive due process, that means that there are a series of rights that are so fundamental that they cannot be restricted by the government unless they pass a very, very strict level of scrutiny. Mm-hmm. There doesn't appear to be any due process with the TVA.
Sure doesn't.
It's like you walk in and it's like, we saw the evidence, we made our decision, you tell us if we're right, and then if you answer wrong, you still die.
And I feel like if you don't get a representative who understands the rules of the system you're in, like a defense attorney, it's a pretty big sign that this is a rigged system.
Right. And the fact that you put him through this entire bureaucratic process where he has to sign as to everything he's ever said. He's got to make sure he's not a robot. And then he needs to walk through this line, come all the way up. And then all of a sudden you're just in a trial. And it's a trial where there's no warning. Loki, to his knowledge, has not done anything wrong. He took an opportunity. It's the one thing he's being punished for following Avengers and Infinity War and Endgame is the one thing you can probably argue he didn't consciously do to be evil.
That's right. It's definitely not something that to him is anything other than the natural outcome of his own choices. I have so many thoughts about this, but one that you just mentioned is he he walked through the thing where they eradicate the robots. How fucked up is it that in this horribly unfair system of jurisprudence, robots don't even get that level of opportunity to speak for themselves? They're just incinerated. I feel bad for the Vision already.
Right. And look at the number of robots the TVA relies on, including your favorite character.
Yeah, including the future super adaptoid. That guy has no rights in the system. I want to know so much more about why robots don't have any rights in their system. Is it because they don't have temporal auras? Presumably, because that's what that machine looks for. And does that mean that they're indetectable by the TVA and that could come up in this thing? And that's why they're extra hard on them or try to keep them out of the process? I have just so many robot questions.
Right. And what counts as a robot? Is the Vision a robot? Is Ultron a robot?
Yeah. If Cyborg from the DC universe was in the Marvel universe, would he be a robot? Do you have to be 75% robot? I guess he does ask if you started out as an organic being that commonly had what's known as a soul or whatever. Still, unsettling questions. And if the Vision doesn't have a soul, again, I don't like where it's going.
What if you're an organic being without a soul?
You mean like if a certain Mephisto came along and took it from you?
Exactly.
Yeah, I want to know where Mephisto lands on this. That's the most important question. It's absolutely not the most important question.
So I have a question, and I want to return to one of our favorite persistent subjects, and I think this is also going to come up more in Loki. Steve Rogers' fuckboy tour through Peggy Carter's life.
Oh man, that's such a good name for it. Steve, you just said? Let me make sure I follow. Steve Rogers' fuckboy tour through Peggy Carter's life.
Yes.
I want a t-shirt with that. Maybe that should go in the Marvelous TV Club merch.
Oh man, that should be our new goal. T-shirt per episode.
Oh my God, that's a great idea, actually.
So, by implication, Mobius says that what the Avengers did to the timeline was supposed to happen.
Yes.
And we now know that the TVA will immediately show up if there is an anomaly, a variance, anything. Nobody showed up for Steve Rogers for his entire life. Which meant he was supposed to do that. And now I don't know if this is the explanation. I don't know if that is what we're supposed to be left with. But why do you think this was supposed to happen?
I have a simple answer to this question, Jesse, because it is the greatest love of our time. Beginning and end. Titanic wishes that it had half of the unrequited sexual frustration of Steve and Peggy. Wow. That's why it needs to happen. I can't imagine being an immortal time being and seeing these two save that dance and then not get some closure for myself. This is all reality TV to the space lizards, and I applaud them for giving Steve and Peggy the happy ending that the audience wanted to see, because they are the audience.
So this raises another implication. How often has the TVA watched Peggy and Steve fuck?
Oh boy. Well, look, if you could... wouldn't you? Would you, if you, without ever bothering them and knowing that it causes no harm outside of the universe? I mean, look, obviously it's probably immoral. Let's table the morality question for a second. Would you, if you were an immortal being who could see through time and space, would you check out Steve Rogers and Peggy Carter, two of the most beautiful people ever, having sex?
I mean, I feel like you sort of set this up for the one obvious answer, which is yes.
Well, I mean, I would, obviously, so I'm tilting the scales. I'm putting my immortal time being hand on the scales and saying,
right, like the heavy,
this is a perfectly normal thing to do.
Like the heavy hand of all existence and time. It's just like, don't you think this is right?
Yeah, it's kind of hot, right?
Yeah, I've got to agree with you.
But it is not necessarily a moral thing to do. Do you think Heimdall watched people fuck?
I mean, I would assume so, but I feel like he would have a moral justification for it.
And he does seem pretty non-sexual as a being. I'm not saying he doesn't have sexual urges, but he certainly seems able to compartmentalize them when he's on the job.
Right. So, I mean, I could see him justifying it as, it's a part of the job. It's a part of his duty observing the realms.
Yeah. I have no idea if the space lizards are as contemplative and serious as Heimdall. I can only hope. And maybe then they would just not be concerned with such base ideas as super hot Peggy Carter and Steve Rogers sex. I don't know.
And one other question. The final scene implies that the TVA has the discretion to determine how to handle people messing with the sacred timeline. They find this staff, this object that they say is from the third millennium, but it's in 1855 Oklahoma in an oil field.
Mm-hmm.
And they just say, let's set our little bomb and we'll go. And they're at the field agent level. This isn't even Mobius level or whatever comes above Mobius. So exactly how sacred is the timeline? Is it just sort of a bureaucratic discretionary function, or is there something higher and more purposeful to it?
Well, I have a best case scenario for you, and I have a worst case scenario for you. In the best case scenario, the agents are like the judge who said that she is basically imbued with the clarity of the sacred timeline by virtue of being created by these beings, and they essentially can project their intentions into or through her. In the field agents, we obviously see from their devices that they can recognize that a variant is happening, and so all of that is presumably tied into whatever the timekeeper space lizards are into in terms of their assessment of these things. We cannot do anything but perceive linear time as beings, and it appears as though perhaps the TVA agents might be the same way, and certainly all of us as the people observing the TVA agents can do nothing but perceive linear time. And something I talked about on Storycast is that is its own kind of prison. So we may never be able to understand the concept of the sacred timeline. And if that were true, if we accept that as a premise, then I think we just have to trust the dear leaders that they are right and we are blind, and we would have to go along with them in a kind of, subjugated state to their insistence of what counts as sacred. So that's the best case scenario, that they are literal gods who are beyond our perception or capable of things beyond our perception, and we have to trust them. Does that make you feel any better?
I mean, no.
Yeah.
The problem is, and it comes down to the same issue with free will and choice that Loki had dealing with this episode, where there's just a level of operation, there's a level of function to the universe, to the timeline, to existence, that even in terms of perception, like, are you even perceiving what's real?
Right.
Are you just sort of perceiving what needs to be perceived because some being decided it? Even in the courtroom, why was it set up like a courtroom?
Yeah.
Was it just because that's what others would understand? Would it appear differently to people from different cultures, different worlds? Did it just exist in that way because that was the closest analogous form that the space lizards could come up with to explain what it is they were doing, or to even slow it down enough so that it didn't just seem like an instantaneous judgment devoid of any real, consideration or utility?
Yeah, I do think Loki kind of hints at that when he keeps calling it an illusion and I see through you. It does seem like it might be one of those things that appears differently to different folks. We did see a scroll getting brought in briefly. I don't know if you noticed that when Loki came in.
I noticed it my second time, yeah.
I'd be curious to see what that orientation film looked like to a Skrull. Because my theory about why it looked like a 60s cartoon is that they had this kid who was the son of someone from Goldman Sachs, which is a hilarious detail that Maeve caught from when he was getting brought in. So maybe that kid saw those kinds of films in school just like we did. And so that's why that was the film that was set up. So perhaps, yeah, the TVA just kind of appears to you in the most understandable form that your mind can comprehend, which would actually lend itself to the idea that there might be shit here we just cannot follow.
Right.
But of course, there is the worst case scenario, Jesse, and that is simply this is the timeline that most favors these timekeepers. They do kind of get up to some shit like this in the comics, if I recall, that they make weird time choices and try to kill the Avengers or something because it favors them or it saves their asses or something. I was trying to look up some stuff, and one site mentioned something about Rick Jones, which I had never read before. So there's a bunch of stuff where they're trying to kill people on Earth to help themselves out. If that's more of what's going on, then the TVA are more like mob enforcers, right? This is kind of a protection racket or something where they're trying to keep everyone who behaves in the timeline safe, and they're committing a lot of murder in order to get their way.
Right. Or even the timeline is like an old-timey factory town. They run it. You use their script. You follow their rules. And if you don't like it, you're drummed out of town, by which I mean taken to the outskirts and shot. And maybe that's how it works. It's hard to say at this point, and it could go either way. It's part of what's exciting about it.
It's also the thing I can't stop thinking about. So that's why I want to get us into our second topic. This is the perfect place to do that. So I am fascinated by the messy ethics of maintaining a sacred timeline. So for this exercise, I want to be clear. This would be something about trying to do this job, assuming this job had some merit. Maybe not all the merit. Maybe it's not the totally best case scenario, but since this show is probably going to show us the TVA sucks and is kind of bad, and maybe they're the real enemies here, or something along those lines, they certainly are doing this for reasons that are not as pure as they're making it out, okay? I definitely feel like that's coming, no problem. But I'm fascinated by the idea of the job of someone like Mobius in a universe where this is actually a function that needs to happen. So if we take their justifications at face value, the idea that an unregulated time stream could likely end everything for everyone, I have a lot of questions. So if you'll bear with me, Jesse, I want to lay out a few things here and see how any of this hits you.
Okay.
When I watched Loki defend himself, as you were discussing earlier, I was reflecting on two things: teleportation and cloning. A few of my friends are very kind and listen to the show, and all of them at some point have heard me make my teleportation rant, which goes something like this. Teleportation is suicide, and it is a super weird idea to me that I really hate. Look, if there's a teleportation system that takes your exact molecules and moves them somewhere else and then recreates you, that might be fine. But most teleportation systems simply eradicate you and then create a clone of you and drop that clone somewhere else. Now, admittedly, that clone has all of your memories and thoughts and definitely operates and functions as an exact copy of you dropped into a new place. But you are dead, right? It would be the same thing as if I created a clone of you that had all of your exact memories, and then I shot you and let that clone continue living. That's what teleportation is to me, and I'm super against it. And I thought about this Loki, and I thought about the movie The Prestige, because it gets into a similar idea. For folks who maybe haven't seen it in a while or don't know much about it, this is a spoiler, so feel free to jump ahead a few minutes if you don't want that. But in one of the climactic moments of the movie, we learn that one of the magicians, right, has essentially been copying himself and dropping himself into a new location in order to pull off a magic trick to wow the audiences for all time. But the original version of him has to die over and over and over again so that the clone can be the one to continue on to pull off the Prestige. And I just feel like this Loki who stood in front of this court and was told this wasn't his story, this Loki feels just as real, has just as much right to existence as any other Loki. Did you feel any of those kinds of feelings, or did any of that, what I was saying, make any sense whatsoever?
It did. And I've heard the teleportation take before.
Yeah.
And it made me think a lot about it, especially as a childhood Star Trek fan that continued into adulthood. The hard part for me about how Loki was treated was not just that he was effectively a clone or a variant who was being told that he was not valid. It was that he was then shown what his life should be and told that his life did not have the value he thought it did, and that his true purpose, his true glorious purpose in life, was to make other people better, get his mom killed, and then eventually die so that half the universe could die, the timeline could be readjusted, and then he would ultimately get back to where he was, which is also kind of an interesting thing that I didn't think about until right now. Telling Loki his own story, telling Loki his own life story, not only it means that he actually has two stories that must occur, presuming that the Avengers are supposed to do what they're supposed to do. The first is that he is always a side character and making other people realize their true purpose. The second is that he must always split off a variant of himself so that others can achieve their true purpose. If the end game storyline has to happen and must happen, it's not just that this Loki is a clone and they're telling him he's the one that has to die in order for the true one to succeed. The issue isn't just that we can't have two. The issue is that the way it's always supposed to happen is that this will happen over and over and over again. And there will always be a Loki that is always kind of the screw up offshoot who has to be punished so that everyone else can achieve their true purpose. It's a really awful way to conceive of your own existence.
To what you were saying before, this would be the same thing, right? As if you, Jesse, were walking down the street and someone walked up to you and was like, hey, here's $1 million in a briefcase, and was like, walked away. And you were like, this is amazing. And you used that money to change your life. And then the Time Variance Authority showed up and said, Jesse, you were never supposed to have that briefcase. You're a criminal now. And you have to die so that the rest of the universe can live. Because again, the implication here, if we're taking them at face value, is that the continued creation of these variants leads to the end of all existence. And I want to get into that. But first, it does feel, right, at a pretty basic level, like there's no way to hold somebody accountable for doing what they would always and normally do through something that is no fault of their own. If anyone should be punished, it's whoever handed you that briefcase. If anyone should be punished, I don't know even where to begin with Loki. It's not Tony's fault. It's not Hulk's fault. I don't know I guess it's Thanos' fault for doing all this shit in the first place. Where does the buck stop for the Loki one?
Right. And then if it's Thanos' fault, why is it that you don't stop Thanos, who takes the time stone, which has the ability to manipulate time? He's not punished for that. That punishment is left to the natural outcome of the timeline. But then this side character who gets swept into the timeline by a completely incidental occurrence that's part of a very complicated scheme to stop Thanos, he's the one who gets punished. He's the one that the TVA focuses all of their ire on.
Yeah, and so to close the loop on the reason I brought in teleportation and cloning in the first place, the idea to me is that just like the version of me that would have to die in order for the copy of me to be teleported, I think that's terrible, and I don't think that this Loki is any less of an autonomous being than any other version. And it feels like what we're faced with here is something like a really strange version of the trolley problem, which many folks might remember from The Good Place. It popularized it, but it's been in philosophy for a long time. The idea, right, that a trolley is heading down a track, and if you don't do anything, it's going to run over 3 people. But if you pull the lever and make it switch tracks, it will only run over 1 person. So is it better to take the action, right? And you feel like you will be essentially choosing to kill the person on the left, but you save the 3 people on the right. Or simply by doing nothing, 3 people on the right will die. That is essentially, if I am following, the mission of the TVA. If Loki is a real person, even as a variant, then the question is, if killing all of these variants from time to time, let's say they add up into the, tens of thousands of variants or hundreds of thousands of variants, that's still a drop in the bucket compared to the trillions of people that live in the entirety of the timeline. Jesse, does that, if their justification is true, again, I suspect we will learn it's not like that, but let's say that it is can you justify the existence of the TVA in that circumstance? Can you justify pulling the lever on that trolley?
Well, from a philosophical perspective, since we're getting into The Good Place, the way that I view the TVA right now is as a natural law organization. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept of natural law.
Yeah, but I'm fortunate enough to work with a bunch of attorneys, but you should explain that for folks.
Okay. So natural law is a sort of Catholic form of philosophy that then turned into kind of a Eurocentric legal principle. And the idea is that law is based on the observation of human nature, and laws can be deduced and generated independent of a state or society's laws.
Right.
So what that means is that everyone has inherent rights. And the thing about it is that usually in a natural law society, those inherent rights tend to go with whatever the dominant religious belief of the time is.
Exactly. This is why they're often used to justify anti-choice BS, which is where when I'm at my work, we're always battling against that kind of misinformation in our journalism. So anyway, yeah, it's a way to basically make a justification for whatever the rules of the usually kind of regressive to very regressive religious organization is looking to justify.
And when I hear an organization that is apparently very well funded or resourced talk about its sacred mission and the sacred timeline it protects, that was actually the first thing that came to mind.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that at all.
And so from their perspective, if they are sort of a natural law version of timeline cops, or time cops, as one might call them, I should write a movie about that.
I hope they all look like, or at least one is played by Jean-Claude Van Damme.
If Jean-Claude Van Damme shows up in episode 5 or 6, this is officially the greatest show of all time.
Absolutely.
And Jean-Claude, you can also show up earlier. I'll take you in episode 2.
Please.
So if they are a quasi or pseudo-religious organization driven by some form of zealotry, then it would be very easy to justify whatever they do. Whatever they do is in service of the good that they know themselves to represent. And so if you kill a variant, if you set off a time grenade, if you decide that timeline X is the preferable timeline over timeline Y, you're doing it in service of the sacred timeline. And so it's not just that the ends justify the means, it's that the means are inherently justified in and of themselves by the actors who employ them. The second you are in the TVA and you decide to do something, it is the right thing.
Right, because it's sacred and it's this natural law, like you're saying.
Exactly. So everything is sort of both prospectively and retrospectively justified, which makes it hard to ever argue with, especially when the people that you're sweeping into the system you've set up don't know you exist.
All right, you've convinced me that that's very possibly how the TVA folks might look at it. But let's say you yourself could know that left unchecked, these variant timelines would cause the end of all reality. Then what do? Are you justified in constantly pruning the bush of time, which is to say, doing a little murder to keep a lot of people alive? If you have certainty about that, which is one difference between these guys and a lot of folks out there who are trying to use utilitarianism or whatever to justify their actions because they don't know what the future holds. They're all prisoners to linear time. The space lizards are not, which means, if they are to be believed, then they know that they're just saving a ton of people. And is that something that could be justified?
The hard part for me is there's an ultimate question that you need the answer to, and how you answer that question determines what the most utilitarian or the most valuable course is, which is the end of time inevitable? If there is a way to maintain time as immortal and eternal and ever ongoing, then I could see the utility of pruning the timelines. But
Right.
if what pruning the timelines does is just sort of stave off the end of something that will always end, then why are you justified in hurting the interests, taking away the life and the liberty of person X or person Y just to save a different person? And the one moral quandary that comes into it too is that it appears that when the TVA intervenes, they attempt to intervene before the damage can ever be done, which means that it's to get into another comparison, like the idea of pre-crime and Minority Report, where there is a wrong that will occur. And because you are certain it will occur, you are justified in stopping it. But that, again, deprives the person who is accused of the crime, who will suffer the punishment, of the free will in determining whether they will commit the crime.
Yeah, I hear you, but I still feel like you're kind of dodging the question.
I am, because it's a heavy question.
It is. When I get stuck on stuff, I tend to apply a very simple idea from a guy named John Rawls,
Okay.
And that is this idea of the veil of ignorance. And for folks who don't know what that is, it's basically the idea that you try to approach difficult decisions of policy or philosophy by trying to, as much as possible, remove your particular position or any particular position from the equation. You try to put yourself behind a veil of ignorance and say, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not particularly rich or poor or powerful or weak or any of these things. And I just try to look at the situation and say, would I deem this policy just, absent as much personal context as I can pull out of the situation? Obviously, in practice, this is very difficult for people to do and very easy to justify whatever you actually prefer through the veil of ignorance. But I still enjoy it as a thought exercise. And I have to say, if it's true that constantly pruning the timeline keeps all of reality, all the trillions of people who are alive now at any given point, and all of the other trillions, separate other many trillions of people alive all throughout time, even if it is finite, it does seem to me like I can understand this as a potentially justifiable system, especially because a version of each of the people who is eradicated does still exist in the quote unquote sacred timeline. I'll just say one more time, because I feel like there's already going to be somebody who's getting mad again. No, I do not think that the timeline will turn out to be truly sacred. I'm just really curious about whether we could ever have a system like this. Should we accept that should it turn out to be true that the timeline were sacred? I don't know.
And something else I realized, we've been having this entire conversation, or at least I have, still thinking about time as linear in the way that you were discussing, where the future is unknowable. But if the TVA actually knows what will happen should the variant continue to operate, then it's no longer an issue of free will versus the restriction of free will. It's, we know how your free will be exercised. And so we're stopping you now because what will occur has occurred, but cannot occur.
Right.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
So if somebody's listening to this and is thinking, Marc, you care so much about the cloned or teleported being not dying. You don't want the copy to die, right? That's the moral justification for all of my anti-teleportation stances and my personal terror against the idea of ever entering a teleporter. It's never going to happen. And so here's where I think the TVA is super fucked up, because they do not have to kill these variants. We know that variants like Loki are only making the choice that they can make in the moment with the available information they have. He is not knowingly becoming a variant. So why not create some kind of space for them? If you can build that fucking massive universe of TVA, Bespin looking cloud city towers, why not create a space for all of these variants to live out their natural lives? It just feels like they do not have to die. If you need to do this activity to preserve the timeline, I think the flaw in the TVA logic, the reason they're probably a signal that they're a bad guy, is because they could just let these people live outside of time in some sort of created reality. These timekeepers are clearly powerful enough to do that.
Well, again, and it gets to theories of justice. They have a retributive theory of justice where someone's done something wrong, so they must pay for it. And the way they usually pay for it is dying. And there's no effort at a restorative or therapeutic system of justice where either the variant can go back and try to fix what the problems that they created, or the variant is led into a path where they could live out their natural life and become a productive member of this alternative variant society. It's one theory of justice that, has its own severe problems in execution.
I could chew on this all day, man, but this is how I got in my feels about the episode. I got the sense, though, that you got in your feels about something else. So let's talk about our emotional reactions to this show. Where do you want to begin?
Well, I just want to talk about why I have so many feelings.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I realized is Tom Hiddleston is about a year and a half older than I am. And so his path, if you think about it in terms of a mortal being, in Avengers, he's early 30s. So he's kind of like gone through his 20s in Thor and has lashed out at his family, tried to strike out on his own. And Avengers is him kind of executing his first big scheme. Like, he's going to find his destiny. He's going to go out and figure out what the world is and become the king, the emperor, the subjugator of mankind, which is exactly what I tried when I was 30 as well.
Absolutely.
And he fails, which you do. When you start out, you fail. And it can be crushing. But in Loki's mind, he failed, but that wasn't the end of it. He could try again. There would be another scheme, another plot, another plan for Loki. And that was sidetracked, not through any choice of his own, but because he got tossed into this sort of Tesseract and TVA world, largely through, and it wasn't really through his own volition. And the part of the episode that got to me was him looking at what his life would become and finding out that he would be the cause, or at least a approximate cause of his mother's death. That he would never really do anything with his life except get his skull crushed, or get his neck crushed, I guess, by Thanos on the path to other people becoming the heroes, to saving the world. And he even ended up where he did because those people whose destinies he helped guide and helped fulfill were busy doing something, and he just got caught up in the crossfire of what occurred. And from my perspective, to be, he's 40 years old, I'm almost 40. And to have somebody sit down with you and tell you in your 30s, every dream you have, it's shit. Like, you will never achieve anything you want. All you will do is cause pain and suffering and death until you die. And it's only when you die that your life really would have any meaning or any benefit to the universe. And that got me. Not that I think, my entire life has been set up to cause pain and suffering, and I'll die in a little bit, and that'll be the only thing that adds value to the world. But again, just that idea of, I think back, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and you thought about how life would turn out. And right now, I don't have many complaints about my life. Like, I have a wonderful family. I am where I want to be. I am doing in large part the things I want to do. But there's always that feeling of like, could I have done something greater? Could there have been something more that I could have accomplished had I taken a different route in life? And for Loki, that was somebody sitting him down and saying, no, absolutely not. You're an idiot. Just fucking stop it. And you're lucky we didn't kill you for this. That is just such a crushing feeling to get. And I thought the way that Tom Hiddleston acted out those scenes and came to the realization of what happened, like, that touched me.
I'm so fascinated by this reaction. I had a really strong reaction, but for a totally different reason. So I want to ask you a simple question. Because you've said this before, and I just want to know if this is what you think. Do you think Loki essentially is a side character, and or watched that and realized that in the grand scheme of the people he has known, he is a side character?
So I'll say two things. The first is that Loki, especially this Loki, believes he is not only a main character, but the main character.
Born to be a king.
Exactly. So part of it is the realization that even if he is a main character, he is not the main character.
Sure.
There are other people whose lives and destinies are more important than his. And that's a realization. That's just something he has not come to accept about the rest of existence at this point. I think from a meta-narrative perspective, it's obvious that Loki is a side character. Loki is a side character in the MCU. And so part of it is, are we watching this as viewers who understand the MCU, and Loki kind of being pulled out and being told, the MCU storyline is what occurs and you are a side character in it? I'm always kind of an eternal optimist and believe that everyone is the main character of their own lives. And even if your life isn't as quote unquote important as someone else's, even if you aren't as well known or as famous, in terms of your own existence, you are still the main character in your own life. And I find that when you start to feel like you're not the main character, that's when a lot of things can sort of feel off in your life, when you feel like everything is happening around you. And I've had that feeling before, and I know a lot of people have too. And for Loki, part of it was also that feeling. To me, I've always associated that, like, I've had struggles with depression, and part of my struggles with depression come with that feeling of, really, like, I don't matter. I'm not the person who's supposed to be here. And for Loki, that was that was him being hit in the face with that by someone who effectively said, I am more powerful than you. I am more knowledgeable than you. And I am telling you that you do not matter in the way you think you do. Mm-hmm. And I think that may be part of it too, that's the part of the way that my depression has manifested itself in the past. And even when it comes up now. And so to be hit with that in this narrative format, that also hit home for me.
No, I think that's really powerful and interesting. I know a lot of Marvelous TV Club listeners may not follow sports closely, but Jesse and I both watch basketball in the NBA. And this conversation about side characters makes me think about two basketball players in particular. One is Kevin Durant, and the other is Charles Barkley. So for folks who don't know, Kevin Durant is a current player. He's on the Nets. They're actually playing as we record this episode of PonderVision. But Kevin Durant went from a team that he had played for most of his career, technically all of his career. They moved from Seattle to Oklahoma City. Doesn't matter. He played for this team, Oklahoma City. He left because he was certain that championships were going to fulfill him. And he won 2 of them by going to Golden State. And after the first one, there was actually a recent profile of him that talked about how he was essentially depressed after winning the first title because it didn't do for him what he sort of thought it would do. And he has a completely different perspective now on what he values. So for Kevin Durant, he essentially accomplished what he perceived as the peak, the highest level of achievement he could possibly have as one of the greatest players in the world. He did it twice in a row, and it didn't do it for him. And then there's Charles Barkley, who a lot of folks have probably heard of. But for folks who don't know much about his playing career, Barkley was one of the greatest players of the 80s and early 90s. But his greatest season, in which I believe he did win the MVP, was basically there to give Michael Jordan a chance to stunt on him and have an epic final series in which Charles Barkley was denied the championship by Michael Jordan, and Barkley never won the ring. And I think there's a world in which you could show Kevin Durant a story of his life where he looks like he's the Avengers and he's done all this perfect stuff, and it wouldn't fulfill him. And I also think you could show Charles Barkley the narrative of his life, because these are people, the reason I bring it back to sports is because these are people about whom we actually do narrate stories about their life. And so there's a universe in which Charles Barkley is just a side character to Michael Jordan, you know? And yet I perceive Charles Barkley as much more satisfied than Kevin Durant, even though Kevin Durant has achieved the things that Charles Barkley most wanted in this world. And I'm fascinated by this conundrum, this separation between this idea of satisfaction, of happiness, of the idea of feeling like you've achieved something, and the elusiveness of that whether there's ever actually an answer to that question of how to do that.
Yeah. And I don't know that there is. And the thing that you bring up is that is not, there's no consistent single answer for everyone. Mm-hmm. There's no world that in which, the same exact outcomes for everyone would make everyone equally happy. There are just things that drive you. There are things that, for whatever reason, be it nature, nurture, some combination in between, that the exact same praise or accomplishment for person A could drive them for years. And for another person, it's meaningless. It's maybe just another trophy in the case, or it may just not even mean anything to them because that's not what they find value in.
No, I mean, as someone who got into USC Film School and didn't go because I had started to make my living doing video production already, smaller stuff, but I felt like being in the world of doing this, not going to that film school will be something I will always wonder about, right? It's just tough to know if I could be in one of these Marvel writing rooms today if I had gone to film school in 2006. We'll never know. It's something I wrestle with too, man. I share that same sense of what could be, what could have been, but also I try at very varying levels of success to try to not forget the Kevin Durant experience, right? That you can have it all and however much more that is than what I have in terms, not in terms of money, but in terms of creative fulfillment, let's say, or something along those lines. I don't know. Like you said, it might just be that we're all wired in a certain way. And that restlessness, it might be part of what drives people to create things. And we're sitting here doing this podcast right now in part because I think of that restlessness.
Right. And, if you are content, is being truly and perfectly content, A, is it possible? But B, even if it's possible, do we necessarily always want that? It might be great for a little while, but then again, if we go back to The Good Place, one of the things that we saw in that show is that there's a point in which eternal contentedness and eternal happiness actually runs out. You just sort of realize you're done with it and you need to move on to whatever that next phase is. That I don't know. We could talk about this for another hour, I feel like. But we should probably get on to our final question.
Okay.
When I saw this episode, I'd watched the trailers, but I was watching much more for the performances and kind of looking for the Easter eggs and things like that than really getting a full sense of kind of the feel and tone of the show. So not thinking necessarily thematically, but in terms of like the feel, the tone of the show. Do you have a direct comparison for the show based on the episode you've seen?
Two things that I didn't talk about in Storycast come to mind for me here. The one that I most closely relate to on this is 12 Monkeys. It's something that's about this question of time and the inevitability of it and whether we can change things. And it's a movie that never answers that question. There's a odd sort of sense of futuristic bureaucracy that reminds me of the TVA very much in that movie. And I really thought that must have been a bit of an influence on this in terms of the feeling that you have, this unsettledness, but also the hope that you can do something, and also the idea that there's two of you running around at the same time. And then the other one that's also kind of along those lines is Looper, which is another movie about multiple I guess Bruce Willis is at the heart of all this, which, it's not my favorite person, but undeniably a pretty important sci-fi actor.
Right.
He, in that movie, obviously there's a young and old version of him running around again. I don't want to spoil that whole movie for folks, but I feel like those movies left me with the same kind of haunting questions and circular logic of time and free will and inevitability and repeating things over and over again as this episode. Did you have anything that jumped out to you? Or do you like or hate either of those comparisons?
I really like both of them. And now I'd never thought about how key Bruce Willis is as a sci-fi actor in so many ways.
It's kind of disturbing.
But yeah, I like both of those comparisons. What came to mind for me is there's a video game called Control. It came out, I believe, in 2019, consoles, PC, et cetera, et cetera. The basic premise of the game is that there's something called the Federal Bureau of Control. And it's a government agency that is housed in this sort of nondescript, brutalist building in New York. So the entire game takes place in this very harsh, brutalist environment that feels like late 60s, early 70s. It feels of a definite era. And they investigate things that violate the laws of reality. And there are certain objects that are kind of the focal points of these violations. And they look like regular objects, a telephone, a movie reel, things like that. But they house this incredible power to breach and break reality. And the entire premise of the game is that there's something called the Hiss that has come into and taken over the Federal Bureau of Control. You're someone who the main character is a woman who shows up, and she both wants to investigate the Bureau, but then also finds out that she was destined to always be the director of the Bureau, but also has to figure out how to stop the Hiss in a variety of ways. And although not directly relevant, it has a lot of those same thematic feelings of, kind of a mysterious bureaucratic agency, this building that feels like it's both of a very particular time, but also so outside of our normal experience that it does not comport with anything we actually understand to be reality or true. And also the way that you interact with the various bureaucrats that you find and rescue, it's kind of like the TVA in the sense that people just assume you know what the Federal Bureau of Control is, how these objects work, how the world works. And so you're just kind of tossed in the deep end, and you have to figure out what is going on around you. That was the thing that immediately popped to mind for me.
One of the hardest things to do in a story like that is land the ending. And I do think that's something Loki is going to struggle with. Did you feel like Control stuck the ending?
I will say that it had a very comic book ending and that there wasn't a real ending. It was more, you accomplished what you needed to accomplish to take the role that you were always destined to have, which was to be the director of the Bureau of Control, but you still hadn't succeeded in stopping the enemy, i.e. you're getting set up for a sequel game or for more DLC or whatever comes along. In that sense, I mean, it felt satisfying because it felt like you sort of mastered what you needed to master and you adopted the role you were meant to adopt. But in terms of an overall narrative landing, I'd say not as much. Because I don't think it was ever meant to stick the narrative landing. It was only meant to stick kind of a character landing. Do
you think a definitive answer on the morality of the TVA is something that you're looking forward to? Like, is that a part of a good ending or a potentially bad ending? Like, what do you think I feel like Marvel's not going to leave a lot of ambiguity, but I could be wrong about that. If they definitely tell us these TVA guys just suck, does that rob us of any of this weird timey-wimey fun?
Well, I think that if that answer comes through Loki, a character whose own morality is all over the place and very situational, I think it could be satisfying just in the sense of if Loki thinks they're bad, then you may or may not agree with him. You may agree with him because you find him charismatic and charming. You may agree with him on the merits. You may disagree with him for any number of reasons. The harder pill to swallow will be is if that conclusion comes through Mobius. Because at least to the extent we've seen Mobius now, he seems to be like a hardworking, dedicated guy who just wants to preserve the timeline, who has faith in Loki, who wants to pull Loki out of the regular system and use him to help find whoever is destroying the timeline, whether it actually is a variant Loki or someone else entirely. And if he is going to have any sort of moral center or gravity in the show, and then it's his conclusion that we're left with, I feel like that could feel a little too pat.
I could see that. Although I think they are tipping their hand to the idea that Mobius might be someone who can wake up to the TVA being an unfeeling and potentially cruel organization. He is already sympathetic to Loki, but even in the timeline when they go back to France, he cares about that kid having the best last few moments, presumably, of his existence, because we don't know the implication of when a timeline gets close to the red, as they talked about, according to their little watches, when it hits that red line. But I'm assuming the entire timeline is eradicated. And that could just mean, like, I don't know if that timeline split includes the entire universe, which means trillions of copies are cut off, or it's just this part of France, or I don't know the full implications of that. But Mobius seemed committed to that kid having an enjoyable last couple minutes. And so I think that cracks the door for them to be able to do something meaningful with his character emotionally. I don't know.
And it may also be that we get kind of a in-between resolution where there's a TVA that adopts Mobius because he's useful. And so the people with morality, someone with a moral center, is just as useful to the TVA as someone without, as long as the job gets done.
Well, I want to say, man, thank you, first of all, for bringing us to the raw place and getting real about, how this episode made you feel and engaging on that. I really appreciated that discussion.
Well, I was happy to share. Kind of unintentionally. I didn't know I was going to go there myself.
No, but it's cool, and it speaks to why these shows, people are debating these as art versus commerce all the time, and Amanda and I have been talking about trying to get a larger conversation about that, but I think this testifies to why the idea that just because it's this large project from this big company that involves this IP and all this other stuff doesn't mean it can't move you to your core. When good stories are told, they can be told in all kinds of places, and this is one of them.
Exactly.
But Jesse, if folks have more questions or thoughts about all of the wild philosophical stuff and and thoughtful things that we discussed in this episode, where can they find and or follow you?
Well, they can find me at the Substack I mentioned earlier, the newsletter. It's actionfigurebirthday.substack.com. They can also find me on Twitter at Jesse L. Taylor.
All right, podcast powerhouses, that's our show for today. We have a ton more Loki to discuss on Character Cast. Christine and I are going to talk all about Loki's morality and the TVA. I might wind up defending the TVA way more than I ever expected as part of that conversation. So look out for that on Monday. We'll do a little look ahead for these characters and see what we think the future holds, even for some of these folks like Casey, who I can't stop thinking about. I love that guy, and I really want to see more of him. So keep track of that. Look for that on Monday. And if you are enjoying our show, please leave us a 5-star Apple review so we can rise in those search rankings. It would mean the world to us. You can also find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. On Facebook, we're over 1,700 people now. It's all the handle of Marvelous TV Club. So look for us there. And you can find me on Twitter at Marc Faletti. That's Marc with a C, F as in Frank, Aletti. All right, Jesse, let's go get us some Josta to drink.